a fantastic week of sports radio here, and this story makes its way to my desk, and it's always fun having book authors on because I try to figure out, what makes you write a book and what inspires one to write a book. And this is a local story, so it's even better from my perspective. We welcome on to the program for the first time Alejandro Danois. He is a local author of sports books and sports stuff, and he has one of the great topics, I think, of my lifetime, and I've been doing this for 32 years, and 32 years ago when I walked into the Baltimore News-American as a copy boy and intern and sandwich deliverer, the Dunbar Poets sort of ruled the place around. There was a period of time where Calvert Hall had their thing going on, but Dunbar basketball in the 1980s and Bob Wade and Pete Pompey after that, Lord knows, Sam Cassell and Muggsy Bogues and all those guys. There is a book out called The Boys of Dunbar, a story of love, hope, and basketball, written locally by Alejandro Danois. We welcome him onto the program here. Good topic, Ali, man. What's going on, Alejandro? Life good?
Yeah, man, life is fantastic, Nestor. I really appreciate you having me on, and your energy's got me hyped up, man. I don't need any coffee this morning.
Well, I mean, a little bit of that goes a long way, man. That's where we... So tell me about the book and the inspiration. And first off, let's start with your background. I mean, I'm a kid from Dundalk. I have only been in the Dunbar gym one time. It was during the Pompey era when Sam Cassell was there. They were playing Lake Clifton. Lake Clifton had a really stud kid. I believe Ron Lucas was the name. And this is the late 80s, and I remember being there with Keith Mills and watching. But that was even on the back end of all the really crazy stuff that happened with that Georgetown Dunbar pipeline. And I know Muggsy went to Wake Forest, but from Wingate and Russ and all of those guys that played there, 30 years later, it makes a hell of a story.
Yeah, it does. And you know what's fascinating is the seeds of this book were actually planted back in 1981, 1982. I currently reside in Baltimore. I've been here 14 years. It is now my home. I love this city, but I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. And my buddies and I were a crew of basketball junkies who probably spent an unhealthy amount of time on the basketball court arguing, fighting, playing, debating, anything.
Did you think you were going to be in the NBA or no?
Did I think I was going to be in the NBA?
Was that your mojo, or was this just for fun?
No, I mean, basketball was just a religion and door. We beyond.
Right? I mean, it was sort of like Sports Illustrated, Sporting News, but there was no ESPN. There was no official who's the best team in the land. It was a playground argument, right? Like, can that team from Baltimore beat that team from New York, or that team from Chicago, or that Lou Alcindor's playing over here and Bill Walton's playing at, all those players of that era.
Yep, and that was the thing, the grapevine is how word got out. That's how we heard about Reggie Williams being the number one player in the country. And this guy had seen them play in the Harlem Holiday Classic, and he said the entire bench is going to play major Division I basketball. They've got the number one high school player in the country by the name of Reggie Williams. There isn't anything he cannot do. He's phenomenal. He's unbelievable. Wait till you see him. But the crazy thing about this team is he's not even the best player on his own team. And so we, 11 and 12
and his best player happens to be like 5'1". He looks he looks a little bit like a midget out there running around, right?
Well, exactly. We said, he's the number one player in the country and he's not the best player on the team, so who is it? And he said, you're not going to believe me. So we badgered him, and he said, and this is a direct quote, he said, it's a 5-foot midget, and his name is Bugsy.
Bugsy, okay.
Called him Bugsy, and we thought he was lying to us. We thought he was pulling our leg. And a couple of years later, I'm watching this new innovative television network with this idea of 24-hour sports programming called ESPN, and I'm watching a Wake Forest basketball game, and I see this 5'3" athletic marvel by the name of Muggsy Bogues, a talent like I'd never seen before, who could dominate a game without scoring a point, and I was just fascinated from then on. So I remembered Bugsy and Muggsy, and I started to put the pieces together. I watched Reggie be the most outstanding player in the Final Four when Georgetown won their only national championship over Akeem Olajuwon and Phi Slama Jama. I watched David Wingate. I watched Gary Graham on the Final Four of UNLV's team. I watched Reggie Lewis because I went to prep school at the time in Massachusetts, and I would actually ride the T into Boston and watch him play at Northeastern.
How many people went to Northeastern games back then? Probably not many, right?
No, I mean,
and that was sort of Larry Bird era too, right? I mean, the Celtics were really something.
Oh, that was the Celtics' heyday.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about the 84, 85, 86 Celtics, some of the best teams the NBA has ever seen. But Reggie captured the city of Boston, and he had a big following just because of how dynamic and exceptional he was. And so, when I heard he couldn't start for his high school team, I said, well, let me find out. And sure enough, it was the Dunbar team I heard about in my playground debate with this 5-foot midget named Bugsy, who was better than the number one player in the country. And so this thing always resonated with me. I would check the box scores. I would wonder, what was this team like with all of this talent? I mean, Reggie Lewis goes on to become the best pro out of all of them and a captain of the legendary Boston Celtics franchise, and he didn't even start. So, to say, when did this idea come to me? It's been there since 81, 82.
Well, and I guess the story takes on different turns with what became of Reggie Lewis's life, and that entire tragedy. I mean, I can't believe I just did a Google search on Reggie Lewis. First off, he was 3 years older than me. I was born in '68, so these guys were all a little older than me. I graduated in '85, right? So I was more like sort of Perry and Terry Farrell at that point, and maybe a little bit more Calvert Hall and Amatucci and the Georgia Tech connection there. And obviously Bob Wade was keeping, and I was a Maryland fan, right? I was a lefty guy. Bob Wade was sending these boys down to play at Georgetown for John Thompson. And, that was a huge, huge source of consternation locally in the 80s and 90s during my formative years. And, and I remember going down to the Baltimore Civic Center to see the Terps play when Bob Wade coached the Terps for 5 minutes after Len Bias's tragedy in 1986. So, that was a momentous time for Baltimore basketball all the way around because these kids didn't just play in Dunbar or were from here. They were going to school at Kansas State or at Wake Forest or at Northeastern or at UNLV or at Georgetown, which, again, that was a big problem around here.
Well, the thing about that was Bob Wade wasn't sending kids to Georgetown. You have to understand what kind of an impact and an influence Big John Thompson makes when he walks into a child's living room and says, I'm going to make sure your child gets a degree, and, I'm going to make sure that they play on the biggest basketball stage in the country.
It was all about the mothers then, right? Now it's more about the AAU coaches, right?
Reggie Williams and David Wingate went to Georgetown, but Dean Smith was in that gym recruiting. UNLV was in there. A young John Calipari, when he was an assistant at Pitt, was in there. Denny Crum from Louisville was in there.
Terry Holland was running around saying, come be my next Samson. I remember that era well, man.
And Lefty Drizel was in that gym every day. So, the thing about Bob Wade, which was so impactful in terms of what he did with those kids, was he was a product of Dunbar High School. He was an athlete there a generation prior who knew these guys' families before they were even born. He plays in the National Football League. One of his coaches is the legendary Vince Lombardi, who he mirrors a lot of his coaching philosophies after. But while he's playing in the NFL, he's coming back to get his teaching certification. And when his career abruptly ended due to injury, he knew he wanted to come back and make a positive difference in his community. He was very, very adamant that these guys were going to work just as hard on their academics as they did their athletics, because he was preparing them not for the NBA, not to be a college basketball star, but he was preparing them in the same way that the great Dunbar coach William Sugar Kane prepared him to make a positive impact as a functioning adult.
Sugar Kane sits behind all of this, right?
Well, he's a key piece to the puzzle. Sugar Kane was the one who established Dunbar's legacy. He's a legendary figure because he kind of puts Dunbar on the national map as their head coach when they beat Morgan Wooten's great DeMatha squad that featured Adrian Dantley, who was the number one player in the country, Skip Wise, the player that many will tell you is
was
the
greatest
player
That's
to ever
absolutely.
come out of Baltimore.
Sure.
And, we're talking about Carmelo Anthony is one of the greatest players ever. He'll go into the NBA Hall of Fame one day, and anyone who ever saw Skip Wise play will tell you that Skip was every bit the talent as Jerry West and Oscar Robertson, but unfortunately, drugs derailed his once promising career. And you'll find, within the book, there are these strands of guys like Ernie Graham, who still holds, being a Maryland guy, Ernie still holds the school record for the most points scored in a game, 44 points. Ernie was a Dunbar product who had all the talent in the world. He went to the Philadelphia Sixers rookie camp, and Dr. J walked up to him and said, "What took you so long? You should have been in the NBA a couple of years ago." But Ernie fell to drugs as well. And so what Wade was trying to do was, again, we talked about the preparation of bringing these guys up to speed to be responsible adults. But at the same time, you had this scourge of crack cocaine and this plague that was decimating the community, in addition to what heroin and the havoc that had already wreaked for years. And so you had all of these elements coming together, in addition to, Baltimore used to be a town where you could come with very little education and secure a great blue-collar union wage in a factory or a steel mill that was running 3 shifts a day.
That's how my father got here from Scranton, Pennsylvania in the 1950s. Absolutely.
Exactly.
40s and 50s,
so
sure.
all of that changes, right? It all changes because the economy changes, the crack comes in, the community is being fractured and splintered and destroyed, and in the midst of this storm, Wade is trying to mold these guys through the power of this game of basketball.
We are chatting with Alejandro Danois. He is the editor-in-chief of the Shadow League and an author. The book is now out. It is called The Boys of Dunbar, A Story of Love, Hope, and Basketball. On sale now. You can find it at Amazon as well as anywhere. You can use our Give a Spit app as well when you're buying that to help our friends at There Goes My Hero, and buy it online. So give me the project, as you see it now, the book out. But as you said, 3 decades ago, you were a nerd who was into this, right? In the same way that I was into sports and
Yep.
Whatever. But 3 decades later, you decide you want to tell this story. And obviously, you have tentacles to all of this. And I'm sure you know Bugsy and even Muggsy for a period of time. He called me about 2 months ago. He was doing something over at Drudel Park to help kids because that's what he does still to this day.
Yep.
But, I don't hear a lot about Wingate or Reggie Williams or even Skip Wise or, the legacy of Reggie Lewis or even Bob Wade, quite frankly. I see Tommy Polly more than I see most of those guys from the Dunbar community.
Yep. Well, Wade just recently retired. He was the head of Baltimore City Public Schools athletics programs for a very, very long time.
Forever. 2 decades probably, as long as I've been on the radio.
Yep. He had a beautiful kind of court dedication ceremony over at Dunbar where they named the court after him. So, Coach Wade is retired now. And,
well, good. He's got time on his hands. I should call him and get him on the show.
Deservedly so, because of all of the years that he put into trying to molding some young folks at Dunbar. And, obviously, that Muggsy still does some ambassador work for the NBA. He flies all over the world, helping to preach the gospel of the game and the league. So you might find him in South Africa. You might find him in China. But he's still down in Charlotte, where he's one of the most beloved former members of the Hornets franchise. Reggie Williams is close by. He's in Maryland, in the D.C. area. He runs his own basketball academy, and he's coached on the high school level and community college and junior college level. His son just finished up his college basketball career as a substitute for the Georgetown teams of the past couple of years. And Wingate is in the area as well. He's around the Washington, D.C. area. So,
by the way, a lot of people would have told you at that time, that Wingate was the best player. And we didn't even mention that. But thinking back on it 30 years ago, I heard as much about Wingate and, Wingate and Maryland, and he was going to change the pro and all that. And I know it never materialized, but he was a bright star as well.
Oh, yes. I mean, on the high school level, David Wingate was a force of nature and definitely highly touted and, talked about throughout the country. I mean, there was no shortage of schools that offered him a scholarship. And so, he seriously considered a lot of other options, and he said, he wanted to go to Maryland. He grew up idolizing that program. That was the school he saw on TV. That was where his heart was. And, his mother was confined to a wheelchair. She did not know anything about basketball, about sports, about what team was what. He said, but when John Thompson walked into his house and made that connection with her, she told him, you're going to play for that man at Georgetown.
And there
it worked out pretty well for him. He won a national championship in college. He had a 15-plus year career in the NBA, mostly based on his defensive ability. Wingate might have peaked in high school and in college offensively, but because of his athleticism and his dedication to the defensive end, he stayed around the league for a very long time.
For all of these guys, and we mentioned, the Skip Wise and obviously what happened to Len Bias, the drug part of the story is a really integral part of this story, right? And how Muggsy stayed clean, is still living a long and wonderful life, and a lot of guys got. And I know that that's a huge story, not just in black neighborhoods, white neighborhoods. We're seeing these overdosed parents, in the recent weeks on the news. But the drug part of the 1980s, whether it's telling the story of studio, in New York in the disco era, but the drugs of the 80s in basketball, in the inner cities, and around this program and around basketball really does tell a story of whether you survived and moved on and lived a life, or whether you became a statistic, quite frankly.
And that's, to me, one of the powerful aspects of this book. I was not going to just write about basketball games and who scored how many points. Nothing happens in a vacuum, and this is something that we touch on in the book. So when you look at the Baltimore kind of drug culture, economy, prior to these guys, it was controlled by some high-level heroin traffickers who kept their inventories regulated. They sold out of pool halls and nightclubs and made deliveries to their clients, right? It was a very, very controlled kind of business model.
And this is pre-cell phone, pre-internet, pre-text. This was payphone type stuff, right?
Right. And then now in the early 80s, what happens is you had a federal task force that came in and took out a lot of those old-level heroin traffickers, but now you had a new breed where cocaine was becoming increasingly plentiful. You had a couple of enterprising businessmen who took a look and said, if this guy gets caught selling my stuff, I got to spend money on lawyers. He's looking at 20 years. But if a kid under 18 gets caught selling, they'll lock him up, and the next morning he'll be back at home, and he'll probably go to juvenile hall for a couple of months, and that's it. So they saw the loopholes in the juvenile justice laws. That's when they started recruiting the young kids and the teenagers, and they changed the business model, and that was when you saw the advent of the open-air drug markets in Baltimore, which ran 24 hours a day for 20 years. So this is kind of some of the stuff that we touch on. These guys are walking the streets of East Baltimore. They're not just playing basketball. They got to go home. They've got to live in the projects. They've got to deal with family members who might be in jail for being drug dealers or robbing drug dealers, or they've got to navigate some pretty treacherous circumstances and situations, and that's kind of the scene when you read the book. I tell people it's a basketball book that really isn't a basketball book at all.
Well, it's a Baltimore book. We know that much. The Boys of Dunbar, a story of hope, a story of love, hope, and basketball. He is Alejandro Danois. You can follow him out on Twitter at Ali Danois, ALIDANOIS. And you can find the book simply by Googling it or on Amazon. Again, if you buy it with the Give a Spit app, it helps our charity at There Goes My Hero as well via Amazon. And it's out now, and you can go check it out. And, for all of these guys and contributions, I know Tommy Polly put together a Poet Pride thing a number of years ago that I attended. Tommy's a dear friend and a Facebook friend as well. So is his wife, who joined us on our tour last year out in St. Louis, because I know he had the St. Louis connections from playing with the Rams. But, the Dunbar legacy and moving on. Now, my wife spent 153 nights in the hospital over Johns Hopkins. And, for the last 3 years, she's battled cancer. And I'm over on Orleans Street, and I'm in front of that high school. I have been in front of that high school hundreds of days over the last 3 years. And there's never a time I go by there when you see the high school and you see the field down the street, you think you think basketball. And even with, Tavon Austin and, different guys that have come through there over the last decades that have become professional athletes, I don't think there's ever a time you go by there without seeing the colors and the crimson and the gold and thinking basketball and thinking of what that represented in the 80s for the NBA, for Georgetown. It is maybe the most famous high school in the country, right, for basketball, if you know basketball.
Yeah, I mean, it could very well be in terms of the history and the legacy. Obviously, the program is nowhere near what it once was. We're in a different time and space. So now you have these prep schools like the Montverdes down in Florida. You have the Oak Hill Academies in Virginia. And the landscape has changed, but anyone who knows anything about basketball, they hear Dunbar. They understand the power of that brand. And you talk about, the one time you were in that gym, and I'm sure when you stepped in there and you saw those banners and you saw those names, I'm sure you heard the whispers of the ghosts. I'm sure you heard the cheerleaders' chants, reverberating in echoes. You couldn't see it, but you could feel the power of being inside there, and it definitely is a very, very special place that has meant a lot to Baltimore City.
Well, good luck with the book, man. I know it's a good story. I mean, I talked to Bobby Sablehouse maybe a year and a half ago, and I know ESPN 30 for 30 was looking to do something. It is an ongoing story, right? I mean, everyone still 30 years later interested not only in telling the story, but having the story told so that people know the legacy of all this stuff.
Exactly. And, when you talk about that level of people knowing the legacy, and you mentioned Bob Wade, I just got a note from someone who said they were a longtime Maryland fan, hated Bob Wade, thought he couldn't coach, thought he was in over his head, and he was just this guy that really messed up a bad situation who cheated. And he said after he read the book, he understood that he was wrong, that he didn't do his research, he didn't understand what kind of man he was, and he was walking around for all of these years misguided, right? And it's about legacy. So you get to find out who these people were back in the early 80s, what their influences were, what made them who they were. And so it really speaks to, the legacy of a wonderful community at a time where people were really struggling, and the beauty of this game of basketball, one of the greatest high school teams ever, and how they inspired people who were struggling daily in their lives.
Alejandro Danois has written the book, The Boys of Dunbar, A Story of Love, Hope, and Basketball. You can reach him out at Ali Danois on Twitter. Hey, it's great having you on, man. Congratulations on getting the book out. I've written 4 books myself, and they're all like their own little, children, and they take months, if not years, to develop. And anytime I have an author on, I always tip my cap just for getting to the to the end of the rainbow and getting it out. Congratulations on that, Alejandro.
I appreciate that, man. And folks can also, if they're old school, they can go into Barnes and Nobles or Walmart or any major retailers and pick it up as well.
The Boys of Dunbar, A Story of Love, Hope, and I keep wanting to say it the wrong way. Love, Hope, and Basketball. Allie, great having you on, man. A pleasure.
Thanks, Nestor. Let's do it again
Yeah,
soon.
I hope so, man. There he goes, Alejandro Danois. You can find him out on the internet. You can find me on the internet as well in the Buy a Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world. On your mobile device, just download the TuneIn Radio app. We come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world, including Dunbar High School, because I've been over on Orleans Street, and I know Orleans and Broadway. You can also get the morning newspaper delivered to your email inbox at 7 a.m. each and every morning. It is all powered up by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. Any breaking news this week will happen first on the WNST Tech Service, and that, of course, brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. And Dennis will be driving you home from 3 until 5 with the SSV on WNST each and every Thursday. Nasty at WNST.net reaches me. I am a very available individual. Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, anywhere you go, we go. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.